When was the last time someone's words cut through you like glass? That moment when a casual comment from a colleague made your heart race, your palms sweat, and your mind spiral into defensiveness? You're not alone. What if I told you that what bothers you reveals more about you than about the world around you? This truth stands at the center of psychological freedom. The things that disturb your peace aren't random. They're not accidental. They're precise reflections of your inner landscape. Mirrors showing parts of yourself you've been avoiding for years. Consider this: two people witness the exact same event. One remains calm, even amused. The other, triggered into a state of emotional turbulence that lasts for hours, sometimes days. Same external stimulus, vastly different internal responses. Why? The answer lies not in the event itself, but in what Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychologists, called the shadow. Those rejected, disowned aspects of ourselves that we've buried in the unconscious mind. Ask yourself, what type of comments consistently get under your skin? What behaviors in others make your blood boil? What personalities make you want to turn and walk away immediately? These aren't random irritations, they're signposts. When someone's arrogance bothers you beyond reasonable measure, you're not simply witnessing arrogance, you're confronting your own denied relationship with self-importance. The parts of yourself you've decided were unacceptable, the desires you've pushed underground, the traits you vowed never to embody. Jung observed this mechanism with striking clarity. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This isn't comfortable knowledge. It contradicts our instinct to point outward, to find fault externally, to make others responsible for our emotional states. It places the burden of our reactions squarely back on our shoulders. And yet, in this uncomfortable truth lies unprecedented freedom. The reality most people spend their lives avoiding is that emotional disturbance requires internal cooperation. External events have no inherent emotional content. No situation comes pre-packaged with anger, shame, or anxiety. These arise from within, from the meaning we assign, from the stories we tell ourselves. What Jung discovered, the revelation that transforms psychological understanding, is that we project outward what we cannot accept inward. Think about the colleague whose self-promotion makes you seethe with resentment. What exists in you that responds so violently to their behavior? Perhaps an unacknowledged desire for recognition, a buried fear that you aren't doing enough to advance your own position, a childhood message that self-promotion is shameful. The intensity of your reaction reveals the power of the disowned material. This is critical. The stronger your emotional reaction, the more significant the unintegrated aspect of self being triggered. Minor irritations point to minor shadow elements, but those white-hot reactions, the ones that hijack your rational mind and plunge you into reactivity, those mark the location of major unintegrated aspects of your psyche. The shadow isn't simply a collection of negative traits, it contains positive aspects too, talents, strengths, and qualities you've disowned because they didn't fit your self-concept or were punished in your formative years. Perhaps you judge someone for their creativity because you've suppressed your own artistic impulses. Perhaps their confidence triggers you because you've denied your own power. The shadow contains all you've refused to see in yourself, the beautiful and the terrible alike. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is the trap most people live within. They experience their emotional reactions as inevitable, as natural responses to an objectively problematic world. They never question the internal machinery generating these responses. They remain, in Jung's terms, unconscious. But you're here for consciousness, for awareness, for the psychological freedom that comes only through facing yourself completely. So let's examine what happens when something bothers you. First, an external event occurs, neutral in itself. Second, this event activates unconscious material, beliefs, memories, disowned aspects of self. Third, this activation generates bodily sensations, tension, heat, constriction. Fourth, your mind creates a story about why you feel this way, almost always placing responsibility on the external trigger. Fifth, this story intensifies the emotional response, creating a feedback loop of reactivity. The entire process might take seconds. It feels automatic, natural, justified, but it's a psychological mechanism, not an inevitable response. What if you could interrupt this sequence? What if you could observe it without being consumed by it? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes crucial. The process of psychological integration that leads to wholeness, not perfection, but wholeness, not the absence of shadow, but the conscious relationship with it. The truth is that nothing has the inherent power to disturb your peace. Nothing. This isn't spiritual bypass or toxic positivity. It's psychological reality. Your disturbance comes from within, from the meaning you assign, the stories you tell, the aspects of self you've rejected. When someone criticizes you and you feel defensive, what part of you believes, on some level, that the criticism might be true? When someone succeeds where you've struggled and you feel envious, what desires have you been denying in yourself? When someone acts selfishly and you rage against their behavior, where have you denied your own self-interest? These questions aren't comfortable, they're necessary. Jung's insight was revolutionary. Psychological freedom doesn't come from controlling the external world so nothing triggers you. It comes from integrating the internal world so triggers become teachers. Every reaction becomes information. Every disturbance becomes a doorway to greater self-knowledge. Consider the people you most admire, those who maintain composure under pressure, who respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively, who seem unshaken by criticism or conflict. These aren't people without emotions. They're people who've done the internal work to understand their psychological machinery. They've made the unconscious conscious, and the result? A profound inner stability that no external circumstance can easily disturb. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming psychologically individual, separate from the collective unconscious, aware of the forces that move through your psyche, rather than being unconsciously moved by them. The unconscious mind is like an invisible current carrying you through life. Most people never recognize its existence. They believe they're swimming independently, making free choices, when in reality, they're being moved by forces they've never examined. Your irritations, your pet peeves, your emotional triggers, these are places where the unconscious breaks through into consciousness. They're opportunities, properly understood. The moment something bothers you, is the moment the unconscious mind presents itself for examination. It's saying, look here, this is where healing is needed. This is where integration awaits. Jung understood that the unconscious communicates through symbols, through emotions, through seemingly irrational reactions. It speaks a language different from the logical mind. To understand it requires a willingness to turn inward, to examine discomfort rather than avoid it. Most people spend their lives trying to arrange external conditions to minimize disturbance. They avoid certain people, certain topics, certain situations. They create bubbles of comfort and call it peace. But this isn't peace, it's avoidance. And the cost is enormous. Every time you blame external circumstances for your internal state, you surrender power. Every time you make others responsible for your emotions, you diminish yourself. Every time you seek to control the outside, rather than understand the inside, you shrink your world a little more. The alternative? Face yourself completely. When something bothers you, ask what's being activated in me right now. What disowned aspect of myself am I encountering? What truth am I avoiding by making this about them rather than about me? These questions aren't self-blame. They're self-responsibility, the foundation of psychological freedom. The path Jung outlined isn't about becoming some emotionless robot, unmoved by life's circumstances. It's about developing a different relationship with your emotions, one characterized by awareness rather than automatic reactivity. You'll still feel. You may still experience initial reactions, but you won't be controlled by them. You won't mistake them for truth. You won't project them outward in blame and judgment. Instead, you'll recognize them as internal events, as information about your psychological landscape, as opportunities for greater integration and wholeness. This brings us to Jung's concept of archetypes, universal patterns that exist within the collective unconscious and shape our individual psyches. We all carry these archetypal energies within us: the hero, the shadow, the anima, animus, the wise old man, woman, the trickster, and many others. They influence our perceptions, our reactions, our emotional lives in ways we rarely recognize. When something bothers you, often an archetypal pattern has been activated. Perhaps the critical comment from a colleague activated the inner child archetype, with its vulnerability and need for approval. Perhaps the domineering behavior of a superior triggered the rebel archetype, with its resistance to authority and control. Understanding these archetypal patterns helps you see beyond the personal. Your reactions aren't merely individual neuroses, they're expressions of universal human patterns, playing out through your unique psychological configuration. This perspective creates distance, objectivity. You can observe awe, the victim archetype is being activated right now rather than fully identifying with the victimhood experience. Jung believed that psychological freedom comes through making peace with all these internal forces, not by eliminating them, but by bringing them into conscious relationship. The battlefield of this psychological work isn't external, it's internal. The real work happens in the quiet moments of self-reflection, in the courageous facing of discomfort, in the willingness to look at yourself without flinching. What you'll discover through this process is both challenging and liberating. Most of what bothers you about others is a reflection of what remains unintegrated within yourself. The judgments you cast outward are judgments you've already placed on disowned aspects of your own being. The criticisms that wound you most deeply often touch on fears you've harbored about yourself. The behaviors that trigger your strongest reactions are often behaviors you've forbidden in yourself. This is what Jung meant by projection, the unconscious mechanism by which we attribute to others qualities we cannot accept in ourselves. Projection isn't something you do deliberately, it happens automatically outside conscious awareness. The first sign of its operation is often disproportionate emotional reactivity, responses that exceed what the situation objectively warrants. When you find yourself intensely bothered by someone's behavior, ask, where do I do this exact thing, perhaps in a different form? Where have I denied this quality in myself? What would happen if I acknowledged this as part of my own potential? These questions cut through projection. They return you to yourself, to the only domain where real change is possible. The shadow work Jung advocated isn't about self-flagellation or endless psychological archaeology. It's about reclaiming the energy bound up in repression and denial. It's about becoming whole rather than fragmented, integrated rather than compartmentalized. This work requires courage. It means facing aspects of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. It means questioning narratives you've held as absolute truth. It means taking responsibility for reactions you've always attributed to others. But the reward is profound: psychological freedom. The capacity to move through life without being constantly derailed by external triggers. The ability to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. The inner stability that comes from making peace with your complete self. Jung described the integrated person as one who accepts the darkness as well as the light. Not perfect, not without flaws or struggles, but aware, conscious of the forces moving through them rather than unconsciously driven by them. This awareness creates space, space between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction, between external event and internal experience. In that space lies choice, and in choice lies freedom. The next time something bothers you, whether it's a critical comment, a perceived slight, a frustrating situation, notice the automatic reaction arising within you. Feel the physical sensations, observe the thoughts, and then ask, what's really happening here? What part of me is being activated? This simple practice, repeated consistently, begins to transform your relationship with disturbance. What once seemed like random emotional weather begins to reveal patterns. What once felt like justified reactions to objectively problematic circumstances begins to show itself as internal psychological machinery at work. You start to see the threads connecting your strongest reactions to your earliest experiences, to messages internalized long ago, to aspects of self disowned for decades, and in this seeing lies the beginning of liberation. Jung wrote that knowledge of the shadow gives a dimension to life, for only when we realize the dark side as present and real can we feel whole, and understand that any good we accomplish comes out of the darkness as well as the light. This integration, this bringing together of the light and shadow aspects of the psyche, is what allows you to move through life with an unshakable center, undisturbed by the inevitable conflicts, criticisms, and challenges that arise. Not because you've numbed yourself to feeling. Not because you've constructed an impenetrable wall of defenses. Not because you've manipulated the external world to protect your comfort, but because you've faced yourself completely. Because you've made peace with the full spectrum of your humanity. Because you've reclaimed the energy that was bound in repression and denial. This is the psychological transformation Jung described, moving from unconscious reactivity to conscious response, from fragmentation to wholeness, from projection to ownership, and it begins with that crucial recognition: what bothers you reveals what awaits integration within you. Your triggers aren't enemies to be avoided. They're signposts pointing toward healing. They're opportunities for completion, for reclaiming disowned aspects of self, for becoming more fully who you are. In the words of Jung himself, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The process isn't comfortable. Growth rarely is, but the alternative, remaining unconscious, driven by forces you don't understand, constantly disturbed by circumstances you can't control, exacts a far greater price. The truth that most people never confront is that emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling external conditions. It comes from understanding internal ones. As long as your peace depends on others behaving a certain way, you remain imprisoned by circumstances beyond your control. As long as your stability requires specific external conditions, you remain at the mercy of an unpredictable world. True freedom, psychological freedom, comes from within, from making the unconscious conscious, from integrating the shadow, from reclaiming projections, from becoming whole rather than partial. This is the path Jung illuminated, not an escape from life's challenges, but a transformed relationship with them. Not immunity from pain, but a different way of holding it. Not control over others, but responsibility for yourself. The journey continues beyond intellectual understanding. Knowing these principles conceptually isn't the same as living them practically. The real work happens in the laboratory of daily life, in those moments when something or someone triggers an automatic reaction. Those moments are invitations. Will you accept them? Those moments when something bothers you, they're crossroads. Each one offers a choice: continue down the path of unconscious reaction, or step onto the path of transformation. But how exactly do you make this shift? How do you transform from someone easily disturbed by external events to someone who maintains inner stability regardless of circumstances? The process begins with recognition, seeing clearly what's actually happening within you when you feel bothered. Most people never question their reactions. They assume their emotional responses are natural, inevitable consequences of external stimuli. Of course I'm angry. Look what they did. Anyone would feel anxious in this situation. You'd be upset too if you were treated this way. These statements reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of psychological reality. They place the source of emotional disturbance outside, rather than inside. Jung understood that our unconscious patterns drive our reactions in ways we rarely recognize. These patterns weren't formed randomly. They emerge from your earliest experiences, from messages absorbed without question, from adaptations that once served important purposes. Consider the child criticized harshly for mistakes. Over time, this child develops an unconscious pattern. Mistakes equal unworthiness. This pattern, buried beneath conscious awareness, continues operating in adulthood. When this person makes a minor error decades later, they experience disproportionate shame or anxiety. When others point out their mistakes, they feel attacked on a fundamental level. The external trigger, making a mistake, or receiving criticism, activates an entire unconscious complex. The emotional reaction isn't to the current situation alone, but to all the accumulated meaning that situation represents. This is how unconscious patterns operate. They connect current experiences to past ones, often without your awareness. They assign meaning based not on present reality, but on formative experiences. Jung called these patterns complexes, emotionally charged groups of ideas or images clustered around a core theme. When touched, these complexes generate automatic emotional reactions that often seem disconnected from the present situation. The first step in transformation is recognizing, I'm not reacting to what's happening now. I'm reacting to what this situation means to my unconscious mind. This recognition creates space between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction. In that space lies the possibility of choice. The moment you recognize that your reaction stems from an unconscious pattern, often from the external event itself, you've already begun to free yourself from its grip. You've moved from unconscious reactivity toward conscious response. But recognition alone isn't enough. The next step involves understanding the specific pattern at work. Ask yourself, what does this situation remind me of? When have I felt this way before? What core belief or fear is being activated right now? These questions begin to illuminate the unconscious material driving your reactions. They reveal connections between current disturbances and formative experiences. They make visible the psychological machinery operating beneath awareness. Jung emphasized that this work isn't merely intellectual, it's experiential. You don't just think about these patterns, you feel them. You notice the bodily sensations that accompany emotional reactions. You observe the thoughts that automatically arise. You track the impulses that emerge. This observational stance, what Jung might call witnessing consciousness, is crucial. It allows you to study your own psychological processes with curiosity rather than judgment, with interest rather than identification. When something bothers you and you catch yourself in reactivity, notice the physical sensations, the tightness in your chest, the heat in your face, the constriction in your throat. Notice the thoughts racing through your mind, the judgments, the narratives of victimhood or righteousness, the future-oriented catastrophizing. Notice the impulses arising to attack, to defend, to withdraw, to control. This noticing itself begins to transform your relationship with disturbance. Rather than being fully identified with the reaction, I am angry, you observe the experience. Anger is arising. This subtle shift makes all the difference. You are no longer consumed by the emotion but witnessing it. You are no longer the reaction but the awareness in which the reaction occurs. As Jung wrote, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner contradictions, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposite halves. What does this mean practically? When you don't consciously recognize and integrate aspects of yourself, both positive and negative, they appear externally as situations that trigger you. Your inner conflicts manifest as outer disturbances. This is why no amount of controlling external circumstances will bring lasting peace. As long as the inner condition remains unaddressed, the outer triggers will continue appearing in different forms. The path forward isn't eliminating triggers, it's transforming your relationship with them through psychological integration. Integration doesn't mean eliminating parts of yourself, it means bringing them into conscious relationship. It means acknowledging both light and shadow aspects rather than identifying solely with the former while projecting the latter. Jung's process of individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness, involves precisely this integration. It requires facing aspects of yourself you've denied, embracing qualities you've rejected, acknowledging potentials you've disowned. This is where Jung's concept of archetypes becomes particularly valuable. When you understand that your reactions often stem from archetypal patterns rather than merely personal ones, you gain perspective. You see that what feels intensely personal is also transpersonal, part of the universal human experience. Every person contains all archetypal energies, though in different configurations and expressions. The warrior, with its capacity for assertion and boundary setting. The caregiver, with its nurturing and protective impulses. The ruler, with its organizational abilities and leadership qualities. The sage, with its wisdom and perspective. The shadow, containing all you've denied and disowned. When something bothers you, often an archetypal energy within you is being triggered. Perhaps your colleague's assertiveness activates your disowned warrior energy. Perhaps a friend's neediness triggers your rejected caregiver aspects. Perhaps an authority figure's decisions activate your shadow relationship with power. Seeing reactions through this archetypal lens helps depersonalize them. You recognize that these energies move through all humans in different forms. This recognition itself reduces reactivity. What felt like a personal affront becomes an encounter with universal patterns. The practical question becomes, how do you integrate these disowned aspects of self? How do you reclaim projections and make the unconscious conscious? Jung advocated several approaches, including dream analysis, active imagination, and creative expression. Modern psychology has added techniques like parts work, shadow integration practices, and mindfulness-based approaches. But the foundational practice remains consistent: conscious attention to what arises within you, not judging it, not suppressing it, not acting it out unconsciously, but witnessing it with awareness and curiosity. When something bothers you, treat the reaction as information rather than truth. Ask, what's being revealed here? What aspect of myself am I encountering through this trigger? What disowned quality is seeking integration? Over time, this practice transforms your relationship with disturbance. What once hijacked your emotional state becomes a doorway to greater self-knowledge. What once seemed like a problem to avoid becomes an opportunity to embrace. Consider the person who judges others harshly for their ambition. Through self-reflection, they might discover their own disowned ambition, perhaps suppressed due to early messages that wanting more was selfish or inappropriate. As they recognize and integrate this quality, they no longer feel bothered by ambition in others. They've reclaimed the projection, or the person triggered by others' vulnerability, who discovers their own rejected softness, perhaps denied because it didn't fit a family narrative about strength. As they embrace their own vulnerability, they no longer feel uncomfortable when others express theirs. The trigger dissolves. This is the transformative power of psychological integration. It doesn't just change how you feel in the moment. It changes what has the power to disturb you at all. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The corollary is equally true. Everything we come to understand and integrate within ourselves ceases to irritate us in others. The external world becomes a mirror reflecting your internal condition. Your reactions reveal what remains unintegrated. Your triggers point to opportunities for wholeness. This perspective completely reframes disturbance. What seemed like something to avoid becomes something to engage with consciously. What appeared to be others' problems reveals itself as your own psychological material awaiting integration. The practice is straightforward but profound. When bothered, turn inward rather than lashing outward. Ask what's being activated in you rather than focusing on what should change in them. See the disturbance as information about your psyche rather than commentary on external reality. As Jung wrote, who looks outside, dreams; who looks inside, awakes. This awakening, this movement from unconscious reaction to conscious response, represents a fundamental shift in psychological functioning. You're no longer the automatic product of conditioning and unconscious patterns. You're developing the capacity for choice, for freedom, for authentic response rather than conditioned reaction. The process isn't about suppressing emotions or denying authentic responses. It's about discerning between responses that arise from your integrated self and reactions that stem from unintegrated aspects of psyche. When you feel bothered, ask, is this reaction coming from my whole self responding appropriately to the present moment, or is it emerging from an unintegrated fragment, reacting to old wounds and conditioning? This discernment itself begins to transform your relationship with disturbance. Reactions that once seemed inevitable begin to reveal themselves as optional. Emotions that once felt overwhelming become informative. The language you use internally matters tremendously in this process. Notice the difference between I am angry and I notice anger arising. The first formulation identifies you with the emotion completely. The second creates space between you and the emotional experience. Similarly, notice the difference between they made me angry and I feel anger in response to their actions. The first places responsibility externally and gives away your power. The second acknowledges both the external stimulus and your internal response, maintaining responsibility for your emotional state. This shift in language reflects a shift in consciousness, from identification with reactions to witnessing awareness of them. Jung understood that symbols and metaphors often communicate psychological truths more effectively than literal language. Let's explore some metaphors that illuminate the transformation process. Think of your psyche as an internal weather system. Emotional reactions are like storms. They arise, intensify, and eventually pass. Most people identify completely with these internal weather patterns. I am this anger, or I am this anxiety. But you are not the weather, you are the sky in which the weather occurs. The sky isn't harmed by storms passing through it. It contains them without being defined by them. This metaphor helps you relate differently to emotional disturbance. When bothered, you can remind yourself, this is weather passing through my awareness. It isn't who I am. It doesn't define me. I can witness it without becoming it, or consider the metaphor of psychological material as submerged objects in water. What bothers you reveals what lies beneath the surface of conscious awareness. Each trigger points to something submerged, a belief, a fear, a disowned quality, an unprocessed experience. Integration involves bringing these submerged elements to the surface, examining them consciously, and incorporating them into your understanding of self. As each submerged object is raised and integrated, that trigger loses its power. The process requires courage. It means facing aspects of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding or denying. It means questioning narratives you've held as absolute truth. It means taking responsibility for reactions you've always attributed to others. But the reward is extraordinary. Psychological freedom. The capacity to move through life without being constantly derailed by external triggers. The ability to respond thoughtfully, rather than react automatically. The inner stability that comes from making peace with your complete self. As Jung observed, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. This awakening doesn't happen once and for all. It's an ongoing process, a continual uncovering and integrating of unconscious material. Each time something bothers you, you have a new opportunity to wake up, to see more clearly, to become more whole. The practice itself transforms over time. What begins as effortful self-observation gradually becomes more natural, more intuitive. Abul Bipelum, internal witness that notices reactions as they arise, that creates space between stimulus and response, that chooses consciously, rather than reacting automatically. Peter Wezabeda Mortis Lexeneng Nisur. This witness consciousness represents a fundamental shift in psychological functioning. You're no longer entirely identified with the content of experience, but also aware of the context in which experience occurs. You're no longer just the actor in the drama, but also the audience witnessing the performance. This dual awareness, being both participant and witness, is the hallmark of psychological maturity. It allows you to be fully engaged in life without being consumed by its inevitable challenges and disturbances. The transformation doesn't make you emotionless or detached from life. Quite the opposite. It allows you to engage more fully, more authentically, without the distortion of unconscious patterns and projections. You still feel the full range of human emotions. You still care deeply about people and circumstances. You still respond appropriately to situations that warrant response. But you're no longer hijacked by disproportionate reactions rooted in unintegrated psyche. The difference is profound. When bothered by something that objectively warrants concern, you respond from wholeness rather than from fragmentation. Your response emerges from present assessment rather than past conditioning. It addresses current reality rather than unconscious material projected onto that reality. Jung wrote, "Everything depends on how we look at things, and not on how they are in themselves." This isn't relativism or denial of objective reality. It's recognition that perception itself is shaped by psychological factors, by what we've integrated versus what remains unconscious, by what we've claimed versus what we've disowned. Two people can witness the exact same external event and have radically different perceptions of it, based on their psychological integration. The more conscious you become of your own psychological machinery, the clearer your perception grows. Clarity of perception leads naturally to freedom of response. When you see situations accurately, without the distortion of projection, without the filter of unconscious patterns, you can respond to what's actually happening rather than to what you imagine is happening. This is where true psychological freedom emerges, not in controlling external circumstances so nothing bothers you, but in transforming internal conditions so disturbance becomes information rather than imprisonment. The process Jung outlined involves both destructuring and restructuring. First, you deconstruct automatic patterns of reaction, questioning their inevitability, examining their origins, recognizing their optionality. Then you construct new patterns of response, grounded in awareness, chosen consciously, aligned with your integrated self. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, incremental, ongoing. Each time something bothers you and you choose awareness over automaticity, you strengthen new neural pathways. Each time you turn inward with curiosity, rather than lashing outward with blame, you reinforce new psychological patterns. The beginning of this process often feels like swimming upstream, effortful, against ingrained tendencies. But over time, awareness becomes more natural than automaticity. Conscious response becomes more habitual than unconscious reaction. You'll still encounter triggers, you'll still feel initial reactions, but your relationship with these experiences fundamentally changes. What once consumed you becomes merely information. What once derailed you becomes opportunity. This transformation represents what Jung called individuation, becoming psychologically individual, distinct from collective patterns, conscious of the forces moving through your psyche, rather than unconsciously moved by them. The individuated person doesn't lack emotion, they feel deeply. They don't avoid challenges, they engage them consciously. They don't escape life's complexities, they navigate them with awareness and integration. What they gain is choice, the space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl described as the foundation of human freedom. In that space lies the possibility of transformation, not just of individual reactions, but of one's entire relationship with disturbance. The truth is that nothing has the inherent power to disturb your peace. Nothing. Your disturbance comes from within, from the meaning you assign, the stories you tell, the aspects of self you've rejected. When you understand this, not intellectually, but experientially, your relationship with the external world fundamentally shifts. You no longer need people to behave in specific ways for you to feel okay. You no longer require circumstances to align with your preferences to maintain inner stability. This isn't resignation or passive acceptance of whatever happens. It's recognition that your responses emerge from your psychology, not directly from external events. It's taking responsibility for these responses, rather than projecting responsibility outward. The transformation Jung described moves through stages. First comes intellectual understanding, grasping the concepts of projection, shadow, integration. Next comes recognition in the moment, noticing when you're triggered, when unconscious material is activated. Then comes the actual work of integration, facing disowned aspects of self, reclaiming projections, making the unconscious conscious. Throughout this process, Jung emphasized the value of creative expression, art, writing, movement, music. These provide avenues for unconscious material to emerge in forms that can be witnessed and integrated. They offer languages beyond the verbal for aspects of psyche that existed before words, that operate beneath rational thought. The transformative process isn't just about eliminating disturbance, it's about becoming more fully who you are, more complete, more integrated, more authentically yourself. It's about reclaiming the energy bound in repression and denial, energy that becomes available for creative living once freed from unconscious patterns. As Jung observed, the attainment of wholeness requires one to stake one's whole being. Nothing less will do. There can be no easier conditions, no substitutes, no compromises. This is the path of psychological transformation, challenging but infinitely rewarding. The reward isn't just freedom from being bothered, though that naturally emerges. The reward is freedom to be fully alive, fully present, fully engaged with life, without the distortion of unconscious patterns. The question becomes, are you willing to face yourself completely? Are you ready to claim responsibility for your reactions, rather than blaming external triggers? Are you prepared to make the unconscious conscious, to integrate the shadow, to become whole rather than partial? If so, you've already begun the journey. Each moment of awareness, each instance of turning inward, rather than projecting outward, each act of conscious response, rather than automatic reaction, these are steps on the path of transformation. The willingness to face yourself completely marks the beginning of liberation. But what does this liberation look like in practice? How do you apply these Jungian insights in daily life? In those moments when something or someone pushes your buttons, liberation begins with a radical shift in perspective. What bothers you becomes your greatest teacher. This shift transforms the entire landscape of your emotional life. Situations that once seemed like obstacles become opportunities. People who triggered you become mirrors revealing aspects of yourself awaiting integration. Circumstances that disturbed your peace become doorways to greater psychological freedom. The practical application of Jung's insights involves specific practices, concrete steps you can take when facing disturbance. Let's examine these practices in detail. This might last only seconds, but it creates crucial space between stimulus and response. It interrupts the automatic sequence that normally unfolds without your awareness. It gives you the opportunity to witness what's happening within you, rather than being completely identified with it. The itself is an act of freedom, a declaration that you won't be controlled by unconscious reactions, that you choose awareness over automaticity. During this, bring attention to your body. Notice physical sensations, the tightening in your chest, the heat in your face, the constriction in your throat. These bodily signals often reveal emotional reactions before your conscious mind recognizes them. By attending to these sensations without immediately acting on them, you begin to develop what Jung might call a witnessing consciousness, an awareness that observes reactions rather than becoming them. Second, the question, after pausing, ask yourself, what's being activated in me right now? What old pattern is playing out? What disowned aspect of myself am I encountering through this trigger? These questions redirect attention from the external trigger to the internal response. They shift focus from what they did to what's happening within you. They move you from projection to ownership, from blame to responsibility. This questioning isn't self-blame. It's self-inquiry, a courageous examination of your own psychological machinery. It's based on the Jungian understanding that your strongest reactions reveal your most significant opportunities for integration. Third, the recognition. As you question your reaction, patterns begin to emerge. You start recognizing connections between current triggers and past experiences, between present reactions and formative messages. Perhaps you notice that criticism triggers disproportionate shame, a pattern stemming from early experiences where love seemed conditional on performance. Perhaps you recognize that others' success activates intense envy, a pattern connected to beliefs about scarcity formed in childhood. Perhaps you see that someone's neediness evokes unexpected anger, a pattern related to your own disowned vulnerability. These recognitions aren't merely intellectual. They're felt, experienced in the body, encountered emotionally. They connect current reactions to their psychological roots, making the unconscious conscious. Jung emphasized that this recognition often involves shadow material, aspects of yourself you've denied or rejected. The shadow isn't just negative qualities. It contains positive ones too, talents you've suppressed, strengths you've disowned, capacities you've rejected because they didn't fit your self-concept. When something bothers you, ask what shadow material is being activated. What disowned aspect of myself am I encountering through this trigger? Fourth, the reclamation. After recognizing the unconscious pattern driving your reaction, you have the opportunity to reclaim what's been disowned. This reclamation doesn't mean acting out shadow material. It means acknowledging it as part of your psychological makeup, integrating it consciously, rather than projecting it unconsciously. If someone's confidence triggers you, perhaps you need to reclaim your own relationship with self-assurance. If their neediness bothers you, perhaps you need to acknowledge your own vulnerability. If their success activates envy, perhaps you need to reclaim your relationship with ambition. Reclamation involves asking, how can I consciously integrate this quality rather than continuing to project it outward or repress it inward? This integration doesn't mean becoming identical to what triggered you. It means developing a conscious relationship with that quality within yourself, expressing it in ways aligned with your values rather than denying its existence altogether. Fifth, the response. After pausing, questioning, recognizing, and reclaiming, you have the opportunity to respond rather than react. This response emerges not from unconscious patterns but from integrated awareness. It addresses present reality rather than past conditioning. It engages with what's actually happening rather than with projections onto what's happening. The difference between reaction and response is profound. Reactions are automatic, conditioned, emerging from unconscious patterns. Responses are chosen, conscious, emerging from integrated awareness. Reactions perpetuate old patterns. Responses create new possibilities. When responding from integration rather than reaction, you have access to your full range of capacities. You're not limited to habitual patterns formed in childhood. You can assess the situation clearly, consider various possibilities, and choose actions aligned with your values and goals. This freedom to respond represents what Jung considered the essence of psychological maturity, the capacity to act from wholeness rather than from fragmentation, from awareness rather than from automaticity. Let's apply these practices to common situations that tend to trigger reactivity. Consider criticism. Most people react to criticism with automatic defensiveness, denial, counterattack, or collapse into shame. These reactions stem from unconscious patterns formed early in life, patterns connecting criticism to threats of rejection, withdrawal of love, or confirmation of unworthiness. Applying Jung's approach, you would first, when feeling criticized, you'd notice the automatic reaction arising, perhaps tension in your body, a surge of shame or anger, an impulse to defend or attack. You'd ask what's being activated in you, what old pattern, what disowned aspect of self. You might recognize that criticism activates a childhood pattern, where mistakes seem to threaten your worthiness of love. Or perhaps it triggers a shadow aspect where you've denied your own capacity for error or imperfection. Imperfection, with this recognition, you could reclaim what's been disowned. Perhaps your humanity, your imperfection, your capacity to learn from feedback. This reclamation doesn't mean accepting all criticism as valid. It means receiving criticism without being emotionally hijacked by it, without making it mean more than it actually does. From this integrated place, you could respond thoughtfully, perhaps acknowledging what's valid in the criticism, while setting boundaries around what isn't. Perhaps expressing how you'd prefer to receive feedback in the future. Perhaps simply saying, "Thank you for that perspective," and then reflecting privately on what serves your growth. Or consider when someone succeeds where you've struggled. Many people react with automatic envy, resentment, or self-diminishment. These reactions often stem from unconscious beliefs about scarcity, worthiness, or competition formed in childhood. Applying Jung's approach, you'd first, when noticing this reaction, you'd feel the sensations in your body, perhaps a sinking in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, a heaviness in your limbs. You'd ask what's being activated. What pattern, what disowned aspect of self. You might recognize that others' success triggers beliefs about limited resources, that their achievement somehow diminishes what's available to you. Or perhaps it activates shadow material around ambition, qualities you've denied in yourself, but recognize in them. With this recognition, you could reclaim what's been disowned, perhaps your own relationship with ambition, your capacity for celebration rather than comparison, your unique path of development. This reclamation doesn't mean becoming identical to the successful person. It means integrating the qualities their success activates in you. From this integrated place, you could respond authentically, perhaps genuinely celebrating their achievement, perhaps feeling inspired by what's possible, perhaps recommitting to your own path with renewed clarity. These examples illustrate a revolutionary truth. Liberation doesn't require controlling external circumstances. It emerges from transforming your relationship with internal responses, As long as your peace depends on others behaving in specific ways, you remain imprisoned by circumstances beyond your control. As long as your stability requires particular external conditions, you remain at the mercy of an unpredictable world. True freedom, psychological freedom, comes from within, from making the unconscious conscious, from integrating the shadow, from reclaiming projections, from becoming whole rather than partial. This inner work transforms not just individual reactions, but your entire relationship with disturbance. What once derailed you for hours or days becomes information that passes through your awareness. What once seemed like problems to avoid become opportunities to embrace. Jung called this transformation individuation, the process of becoming psychologically individual, separate from collective patterns, conscious of the forces moving through your psyche, rather than unconsciously moved by them. The individuated person doesn't lack emotion, they feel deeply, they don't avoid challenges, they engage them consciously, they don't escape life's complexities, they navigate them with awareness. What they gain is freedom, the freedom to respond from wholeness rather than react from fragmentation, the freedom to choose rather than be chosen by unconscious patterns, the freedom to create rather than merely repeat. This freedom manifests practically in several ways: freedom from constant emotional reactivity. When something bothers you, you no longer remain hijacked by the reaction for hours or days. You might feel the initial response, but you don't become identified with it. You witness it, understand it, and move through it with awareness. Freedom from compulsive avoidance. You no longer need to construct your life around avoiding triggers. You don't require others to walk on eggshells around certain topics. You don't limit your experiences based on what might disturb you. You develop the capacity to engage with challenging situations from a place of integration, rather than fragmentation. Freedom from projection. You stop making others responsible for your emotional states. You recognize that your reactions reveal more about your psychology than about external circumstances. You take ownership of your responses, rather than blaming others for causing them. Freedom from identification with partial aspects of self. You no longer mistake a fragment for the whole. You recognize when you're operating from wounded parts, from shadow aspects, from unconscious patterns, and you reconnect with your more integrated awareness. Freedom to respond creatively. Rather than repeating the same old reactions to the same old triggers, you develop the capacity for fresh responses. You're not limited to patterns formed in childhood. You can assess current reality clearly and respond in ways aligned with your values and goals. These freedoms represent what Jung considered the essence of psychological maturity. Authenticity, to be fully yourself, undiminished by repression, undistorted by projection, integrated rather than fragmented. The practical path toward this maturity involves consistent application of the practices we've explored, pausing when triggered, questioning reactions, recognizing patterns, reclaiming projections, responding from integration. This application isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process. Each trigger offers a new opportunity for integration. Each disturbance presents another invitation to wholeness. Over time, the very things that once bothered you most begin to bother you least. Not because you've become numb or detached, but because you've integrated what those triggers were activating. You've reclaimed the projections. You've made the unconscious conscious. What remains is a profound inner stability, not the fragile stability that depends on controlling external conditions, but the authentic stability that emerges from psychological integration. This stability doesn't make you emotionless or disengaged. Quite the opposite. It allows you to feel more fully, to engage more authentically, without the distortion of unconscious patterns and projections. You still experience the full range of human emotions. You still care deeply about people and circumstances. You still respond appropriately to situations that warrant response, but you're no longer hijacked by disproportionate reactions rooted in unintegrated psyche. In practical terms, this means you can receive criticism without collapsing into shame or lashing out in defense. You can witness others' success without falling into envy or self-diminishment. You can navigate conflict without being consumed by anger or fear. You can face uncertainty without being overwhelmed by anxiety. These capacities emerge not from suppressing emotions but from integrating the aspects of self those emotions reveal, not from controlling external circumstances, but from transforming internal conditions. Jung wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering." This perspective reframes disturbance entirely. What we often try to avoid, the discomfort of confronting our shadow, the pain of facing disowned aspects of self, becomes the very path to liberation. The legitimate suffering Jung referred to isn't wallowing in old wounds or indulging in self-pity. It's the conscious encounter with aspects of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding or denying. It's the courageous facing of uncomfortable truths about your psyche. It's the willingness to feel fully what arises when unconscious material becomes conscious. This encounter isn't easy. Integration isn't comfortable. Transformation doesn't occur without the death of old patterns, old identities, old ways of being, but the alternative, remaining unconscious, driven by forces you don't understand, constantly disturbed by circumstances you can't control, exacts a far greater price. The practical application of Jung's insights ultimately leads to a question: how will you relate to what bothers you? Will you continue the pattern of avoidance, suppression, projection, or will you choose the path of awareness, integration, transformation? Every time something disturbs your peace, you face this choice anew. Every trigger presents another opportunity to wake up, to see more clearly, to become more whole. The path isn't about becoming someone who never feels bothered. It's about transforming your relationship with disturbance from enemy to teacher, from obstacle to opportunity, from prison to liberation. This transformation represents what Jung considered the highest purpose of human life, the journey toward wholeness, toward consciousness, toward the full expression of your unique psychological potential. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you think you should be, not who others expect you to be, not some idealized version without shadow or complexity, but your complete self, integrated, aware, whole." This journey toward wholeness naturally leads to a different relationship with disturbance. What bothers others may not bother you, not because you've become detached or indifferent, but because you've integrated what those triggers activate. You develop what might be called psychological immunity. Not immunity from feeling or caring, but immunity from being hijacked by unconscious reactions. This immunity doesn't come from avoiding triggers, but from transforming your relationship with them through integration. The practical result is profound inner stability, the capacity to maintain your center regardless of external circumstances. Not the brittle stability that depends on controlling conditions, but the authentic stability that emerges from psychological wholeness. This stability becomes particularly valuable in challenging situations, in conflict, in crisis, in times of significant change or loss. When others might be consumed by reactivity, you maintain the capacity for thoughtful response. When circumstances might overwhelm, you find your ground in awareness rather than automaticity. The application of Jung's insights extends beyond individual psychology to relationships, work, and broader social contexts. As you become less reactive, your relationships transform. As you take responsibility for your emotional states, your interactions with others become more authentic. As you integrate shadow material, your perception of others grows clearer, less distorted by projection. In work contexts, you develop the capacity to receive feedback without defensiveness, to navigate conflicts without escalation, to lead from integration rather than from unconscious patterns. Your effectiveness increases not despite emotional challenges, but because of how you engage with them. In broader social contexts, you become less susceptible to collective projections, to us versus them thinking, to the unconscious patterns that drive societal conflicts. You maintain the capacity for nuanced understanding, even in polarized situations. These extensions of individual psychological work represent what Jung considered the ripple effects of individuation. As you become more conscious, more integrated, more whole, you naturally affect the systems you participate in. Your transformation doesn't occur in isolation, but in relationship with the broader world. The practical application of Jung's insights ultimately leads to a revolutionary perspective. Nothing has the inherent power to disturb your peace. Nothing. This isn't spiritual bypass or toxic positivity. It's psychological reality. Your disturbance comes from within, from the meaning you assign, the stories you tell, the aspects of self you've rejected. When you understand this, not intellectually, but experientially, your relationship with the external world fundamentally shifts. You no longer need people to behave in specific ways for you to feel okay. You no longer require circumstances to align with your preferences to maintain inner stability. This understanding doesn't make you passive in the face of genuinely problematic situations. It actually increases your effectiveness because you respond from clarity rather than reactivity, from integration rather than from fragmentation. The truth is that emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling external conditions. It comes from transforming internal ones. Not by suppressing emotions or denying authentic responses, but by integrating the aspects of self those emotions reveal. This integration is the heart of Jung's psychological work, the bringing together of conscious and unconscious, of light and shadow, of accepted and rejected aspects of self. Not to create some perfect idealized version of yourself, but to become more fully who you already are beneath the layers of conditioning, suppression, and unconscious patterning. The practical path involves consistent application of the practices we've explored, pausing when triggered, questioning reactions, recognizing patterns, reclaiming projections, responding from integration. Each application strengthens new neural pathways, reinforces new psychological patterns, builds capacity for awareness rather than automaticity. Over time, what begins as effortful practice becomes more natural, more intuitive. The witness consciousness that once required deliberate cultivation becomes more readily available. The space between stimulus and response that once demanded conscious creation expands naturally. This is the psychological transformation Jung described, moving from unconscious reactivity to conscious response, from fragmentation to wholeness, from projection to ownership. And it begins with that crucial recognition: what bothers you reveals what awaits integration within you. Your triggers aren't enemies to be avoided. They're signposts pointing toward healing. They're opportunities for completion, for reclaiming disowned aspects of self, for becoming more fully who you are. The invitation stands: will you face yourself completely? Will you make the unconscious conscious? Will you integrate what's been disowned rather than continuing to project it outward? If you accept this invitation, know that you're embarking on the journey Jung considered most worthy of human effort, the journey toward wholeness, toward consciousness, toward consciousness, toward the full expression of your unique psychological potential. This journey doesn't end. Integration isn't a destination, but an ongoing process. Each layer revealed leads to another awaiting discovery. Each aspect integrated uncovers another seeking acknowledgement. But with each step, with each moment of awareness, with each act of integration, your relationship with disturbance transforms. What once controlled you becomes information. What once imprisoned you becomes opportunity. What once seemed like your greatest problem reveals itself as your greatest teacher. In Jung's words, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This choice, the choice for consciousness over unconsciousness, for integration over fragmentation, for response over reaction, stands at the heart of psychological freedom. Choose wisely, choose awareness, choose wholeness, and watch as the very things that once bothered you most become the doorways to your greatest liberation. Leave your thoughts below about what bothers you most and how you might view it differently after understanding Jung's perspective. Your comment helps others see they're not alone in this journey of integration. Subscribe to continue exploring the depths of human psychology through the wisdom of history's greatest minds. Until next time, may you find freedom in facing yourself completely.